So guys, this is the full enchilada right now when it comes to the college football playoff. This is post week 12. We've got 1 week left in the regular season. Where does each team stand in terms of making the playoff? How many scenarios do they have? We're going to talk through everything. And as you guys can see, Georgia sitting, of course, the 86% chance to make the playoff. They're a virtual lock, according to 538 and according to ESPN. As long as they beat Georgia Tech, even if they lost to LSU in the SEC championship, they are in. But we all predict Georgia to finish 13-0, to beat LSU, and to be the number 1 overall seed. They would be playing in Atlanta if that is the case. When it comes to Ohio State, it's very simple, guys. Ohio State right now, sitting at around 7-point favorites over Michigan. They win, they're in. They face a terrible, Big Ten West team. I think it's going to be Iowa. Should be an easy win for them. But for Ohio State, this is a very unique situation. If Ohio State loses to Michigan, they can still make the playoff. A lot of it comes down to, in my opinion, what happens with USC and what happens with Notre Dame. If Notre Dame beats USC, not only is that big for Ohio State if they lose to Michigan, because then USC would be knocked out and Ohio State wouldn't have to worry about USC being in front of them, but that really revs up Ohio State's week 1 win, their resume. They probably at that point, if Notre Dame beats USC, the Buckeyes have 2 top 10 wins, and Ohio State is looking at possibly being the number 4 overall seed. Remember, guys, Ohio State is an extremely attractive team to the committee because they have the biggest fan base in college football. They would draw great ratings in a 1v4 matchup versus Georgia. I think if you're talking about, because that would come down to, if Ohio State loses to Michigan and then Notre Dame beats USC, you're talking about deciding, it would be Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2, TCU number 3, and then probably a 1-loss Clemson, who would be the ACC champions, and a 1-loss Ohio State. And I think based on what the committee thinks of the ACC, they would pick Ohio State. So for Ohio State, you beat Michigan, you're in as the 2 seed, no doubt. Unless Georgia somehow loses, then you're the 1 seed. You're probably in as the 2 seed. TCU, they need to win. TCU, if they lose a game, they're not going to make it. They have to win out. And if they do win out, let's say all Georgia, Ohio State, and TCU win out, there's your 1, 2, and 3. I have a feeling somebody's going to lose. We'll have to see. And then right now we know Michigan is the number 3 overall seed. Michigan, kind of a similar spot as Ohio State, but Michigan's problem is the non-conference schedule. And it'll be really interesting because I think if Michigan loses to Ohio State and USC wins out, it's not going to matter. USC is going to be in. They're going to be the Pac-12 champions. They're going to have a really impressive resume with wins that, over Notre Dame and over a possible good team in the Pac-12 championship. But if USC loses in the Pac-12 championship or against Notre Dame this next week in the non-conference game, and Michigan has 1 loss, you're talking about a 1-loss Clemson team who's an ACC champion versus a 1-loss Michigan team, and that's where Michigan's non-conference resume and their strength of schedule really hurts them. Michigan fans have to understand that win over UConn, because UConn is now 6-6. UConn is still ranked, I believe, 120th out of 131 teams, according to ESPN FPI. They are horrible. I know they're 6-6. I know they've won a lot of close games. They're Michigan, and really, Michigan fans have to blame the administration. They had a non-conference game with UCLA that they wiped off because they wanted an extra home game, and it might end up crushing them. If they would have played UCLA this year at home, Michigan is in the exact same spot Ohio State is in, to where you have the big non-conference win, and you have that buffer, As long as USC loses one time in the next 2 games, the loser of Ohio State Michigan is in. I think it becomes a little bit more unlikely for Michigan if you're dealing with a one-loss Clemson team. As, again, we talked about TCU, they've got to win out. If they lose once, it doesn't matter if they win. If they lose next week, they're out. Even if they win the Big 12 championship, if you look at their resume, if you look at their metrics, their game control, guys, trust me, if TCU loses once, they are out unless crazy stuff happens. Clemson, they need to win out. I think Clemson's biggest issue is what the committee currently thinks of the ACC, and also another problem for Clemson, North Carolina, who was possibly going to be a top 15 win in the ACC championship for Clemson, just got upset last night as 21-point favorites against Georgia Tech, and Drake May's Heisman hopes completely go to the wind. So for Clemson right now, it gives them a 51% chance. They've got South Carolina. You know what? Maybe South Carolina turns out to be a pretty decent win for Clemson considering what South Carolina just did to Tennessee. But guys, for Clemson, I think it's very hard for them to get into the playoff because you need USC to lose. And then you're talking about an argument between Clemson and Michigan or Ohio State. That's the tentative argument we're looking at right now. If TCU loses, though, that opens up. See, if I'm Clemson, I'm hoping TCU loses in the Big 12 championship game, probably to Kansas State. And my whole thing is, I think the most likely scenario is TCU probably does lose because I cannot fathom 3 teams finishing 13-0. I just think that there's no way it's going to happen. So I would say right now, Georgia is the number 1 seed. Ohio State is the number 2 seed. What happens with USC? Like, this is so, because it's like USC wins out, they're the number 3 seed. If TCU loses, now we're looking at Ohio State versus USC in the first round. We're possibly looking at Georgia versus Michigan in a rematch of last year in the first round as well. There is a lot to sort out, and then you do have LSU in a position to where if LSU does beat the number 1 team in the nation, Georgia, they've got Texas A&M. They're probably going to win that game. We know Texas A&M is pretty much a dead program. LSU is entering the SEC championship game at 10-2. If they beat Georgia, there is an expectation. I would have to look at the metrics, but the expectation is LSU would be the first 2-loss team to make the playoff. It's not likely. We think that Georgia is going to win that game, but it is important to note Georgia is not indestructible. Georgia just struggled on offense against Kentucky. They scored 16 points. I know it was cold, but that offense for Georgia, there's a lack of playmakers. There's a lack of explosive plays. They're going to be heavy favorites over LSU, I know, but it could be a situation where Georgia already knows they're in the playoff. They won the national title last year. Maybe there's not a huge motivation in the SEC championship, and maybe the SEC tries to resurrect itself and get 2 teams into the playoff where I don't even know what the committee would do. There's no way they could make a Georgia-LSU rematch. Would they put LSU in at number 4 and Georgia would drop to 2 or 3? And then it would be Ohio State versus LSU in the first round and Georgia against, let's just say, TCU or USC? Is that the situation we're looking at there? So guys, there is a lot of stuff. Georgia is virtually in. Ohio State has a lot of paths. The only way I see Ohio State missing is if Ohio State loses to Michigan by double digits, they don't look good, USC wins out, Clemson wins out, and LSU beats Georgia. That's a horror show for Ohio State because TCU goes undefeated as well. TCU is obviously going to be ranked above Ohio State. Michigan's ranked above Ohio State. A 1-loss Georgia would probably be ranked above Ohio State, and you'd be dealing with a 1-loss Clemson, who's the ACC champion. You'd be dealing with USC, who's a 1-loss Pac-12 champion. You have issues there. The key thing for Ohio State, if you do lose to Michigan, you need to pray that Notre Dame beats USC because it's a double positive. USC gets eliminated and Notre Dame gives you an even more of a quality win because if Notre Dame beats USC on the road, they probably become a top 10 team in the country, and you've also got the win against Penn State as well. So right now, guys, the situation, North Carolina is out of it. Tulane right now, possibly going to be the New Year's Six representative out of the group of 5. They've got a huge game upcoming with Cincinnati. It is a total toss-up on the road. That is great American, good American football. You can take a look. I thought this was interesting. How about the ELO? The ELO ratings have TCU in front of Ohio State. I don't know how, but then the FPI has TCU all the way down at 15, and they have USC all the way down at 14. That's because TCU and USC have not been impressive in terms of their wins. But again, we just saw Ohio State and Michigan struggle against lesser teams as well. So I don't know what to make of everything right now. I think what we do know, I would say there's about an 80% chance Georgia is the 1 seed. I would say the winner of Ohio State and Michigan is the 2 seed. After that, it gets hairy because you're projecting. Is TCU going undefeated? If TCU loses once, I will say on the record, they're out. Clemson, if they lose again, they're out. USC, if they lose again, they're out. If I had to look ahead and predict, I do think TCU loses in the Big 12 championship. I think they do. So they would be out. We could, again, the Big 10 would love both Ohio State and Michigan to make it, but does the committee want a Georgia-Michigan rematch? Would the committee want that? I don't think they would. Would they have a choice? Maybe they go with Clemson. I don't know. But the current situation right now is Ohio State winning in, but they have multiple paths. TCU has to win. Clemson has to win to have a chance. And then hope USC loses. Hope Michigan gets blown out by Ohio State, so they're possibly out of the picture. And then hope LSU. Everyone wants LSU to lose because LSU could just straight up steal a spot. And then all of these other teams, you would think, Oregon is out, Kansas State is out. These are great teams possibly for a 12-team playoff, but where we stand right now with the 4-team playoff, they are pretty much irrelevant. And we're just talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teams. 7 teams right now fighting for 4 spots. That's what we have. We have 7 teams for 4 spots. I would say LSU and Clemson are probably the 2 teams that I would be pretty confident will not make it. But that is just my prediction. And then it'd be 5 teams for 4 spots. And you have the situation with Ohio State and Michigan facing each other. How does that play out? Does TCU go undefeated? These are all things we're going to be watching. And guys, that is the updated playoff. That is all of the scenarios that I can think of in terms of who can possibly get in. USC has to win out. LSU has to win out. Michigan, there's a little wiggle room. But again, does the non-conference schedule crush Michigan? Let's say they lose to Ohio State by 10. How about the Blake Corum injury? I think Blake Corum will play, but we don't know how healthy he actually is. And then you start dissecting a Michigan non-conference schedule if they are a 1-loss team who doesn't even make the Big Ten championship game, and you compare them to a Clemson, who wins their conference championship. You compare them to USC, who maybe wins the Pac-12 as a 1-loss team. If you are Michigan, you're rooting against USC. If you're Michigan and you lose to Ohio State at noon, root against USC, root against TCU, root against Clemson. Bottom line. And then obviously root against LSU in the SEC championship game. So it's just teams are rooting against each other. That's kind of how this is setting up. And you guys can see next week, Georgia in their rivalry game against Georgia Tech, 98% chance to win. Ohio State sitting at a 67% chance if they beat Michigan. They're going to, wow, I would think they would have a 100% chance to make the playoff, but they're at 96. You can see if Michigan loses to Ohio State, they still have a legitimate chance. Let's say, I would think Clemson would beat South Carolina. Let's say TCU loses to Iowa State, Michigan goes up a little bit. USC loses, Michigan's almost at 50%. So you need other teams to lose in that scenario. I do think TCU will beat Iowa State, but guys, Iowa State is a lot better than their 4-7 record. That's all I'm going to say. And then TCU also has to beat possibly Kansas State in the Big 12 championship game. If Ohio State loses to Michigan, it brings them down to a 26% chance. I think that's mainly because we don't know what else is going to happen. I think Ohio State, it depends. The horror scenario, this is the two horror results for Ohio State. They lose to Michigan and USC beats Notre Dame. That is worst case scenario. Now your win against Notre Dame gets devalued because Notre Dame has 4 losses and USC gets propelled even higher. So that would be a horror case scenario for Ohio State. But either way, guys, that is the full breakdown on the playoff picture right now. We will see what happens. It's going to be a crazy final week. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description.